Hello, welcome to a new video. I have now lived in Scotland for 5 years and I've been getting a lot of requests to talk about, how my immigration story has started and what my reasons were for moving to Scotland, and most of all, whether I recommend moving to Scotland to anyone who's considering doing it. And for all of this to make sense, it would probably be good for me to start off with telling you a little bit about my background. So I'm German and I grew up in Germany, and I've always felt like I was a bit of a misfit in Germany. Like, I don't want to go too much into detail about my reasons why I left Germany because it can very easily get very, very negative. So going back a little bit, growing up, I've always been obsessed with English, and I don't even know where it comes from. It just always felt like English made so much sense in my mind in a way that German never did. So I always watched TV in English, I always read books in English. I started this very, very early on. So in my later years of high school, I wanted to go to high school in America because that's something that people in Germany just do for some reason. So I ended up staying with a family in Washington State for a year, and I went to high school there, and I did really enjoy it. I loved Washington, it's so beautiful. In America, I very much felt like a misfit. Like, I just didn't really feel like I became part of the community. So when I came back, because I obviously still had to finish high school in Germany, started studying biology in Germany as well, which is like a whole different story of why I studied biology and how I basically dug this grave myself. I felt very isolated during my bachelor's degree. I was terrified of leaving the house. I had terrible panic attacks all the time. It was weird. It was definitely an interesting period of my life. But then my mom one day came up with the idea that we should do a bus trip through Scotland because she had always been a big fan of Outlander, and she was just very keen to see many of the locations. And as someone who has lived in Washington State, I love a good rainy, moody hillside. So I was like, yes, let's do it. So we went on this bus trip with a big group of Germans. We were just like carted from one of the big sites to the other ones, and we did, like Glencoe, Fort William, Fort Augustus, Loch Ness, Isle of Skye. So it was very much one of those trips. But I absolutely loved it. There's just something about, the Scottish countryside and also all of these beautiful Victorian buildings. And I've just always felt like if I surround myself with beauty, it creates a sense of peacefulness in my mind. So being in Scotland was really weird because I didn't have panic attacks. I wasn't constantly anxious. And I very vividly remember sitting in Ballachulish in the morning, and we were watching the sunrise over the Burial Islands. And I just said to my mom, I'm going to move to Scotland. And she was like, yeah, sure, you're going to move to Scotland. But spoiler, I did. So then we went back to Germany, obviously, and I still had to finish my bachelor's degree. But I ended up getting the opportunity to go abroad for my research for the bachelor's thesis. And I happened to be going to Scotland. I mean, this was totally not completely planned, and that's kind of how I first moved here. So if you remember my first videos in which I was speaking German, so they're not that accessible, that was how I first started this YouTube channel, being like, I'm Tally and I am moving to Scotland, and that was 6 years ago. So in between I had to move forth and back because I still had to do the master's degree and everything, but I have now consistently been living in Scotland for 5 years, and that is how I first got here. So I arrived in Dundee in January 2018, and that was my first time living in Scotland, and I was so thrilled. I was so excited. I was like, I'm going to make this count. But I was originally just scheduled to be here for half a year to do the research and then come back to do my master's degree. So I moved into that flat in Dundee, and it was actually a really lovely flat, but it was so cold. And it was also the time of the beast from the east. So it was generally a very cold winter. And I was just freezing. And it was also a flat that was a flat share, and the landlady actually lived in the flat, which was a bit bizarre. But I could not control the heating and I was just freezing. So I ended up buying the thickest blanket, and I started wearing coats inside the house, and I was wearing like little gloves and everything because I just didn't know what to do with myself in this cold. And then eventually my parents and I managed to get a little heater. The weird thing is, when you come from a different country, you're very used to places that you can buy stuff. Because if I wanted to buy a little electric heater in Germany, I would go to like Saturn or something. But coming to Scotland, it was almost like, where do I even buy these things? Now I would just order it off Amazon. I don't know why I didn't think of it then. But I was just even like, where do I get a heater from? So we managed to figure out that Argos is a place where you can buy this stuff. But it was just so weird being in a new country and even being like, I don't know where to buy things. I'm so cold. I don't know what to do. So my flat in Dundee was the first time I ever had to flat share because the rent here is just so much more expensive than it is in Germany. So I actually paid more money for a room in a 6-bed flat that was shared with so many other people compared to my studio flat with a balcony in Germany. But in the end, it was actually really lucky, because that first day I came into the flat with this huge suitcase and I was very overwhelmed, and I was just like, what's even happening? And it was a maisonette flat, so it had this tiny staircase that wound up to where the rooms were. And my flatmate welcomed me, and she was off sick for the day, but she saw my suitcase and she was like, I'm gonna help you. So she carried the entire suitcase up the stairs, and I was just there like, thank you. She actually ended up becoming one of my very best friends, and she even was my maid of honor at my wedding. So that is how I met my friend Lotte, because we shared a flat together. And I've never been very close to people in Germany. I was struggling and felt very isolated. So it was a really weird experience to share this flat and have many people around me that were all super friendly, that I was getting on very well. So we had another flatmate called James, and we were all just sitting in the kitchen together at night and singing songs and just, having fun. And it was such a weird experience, honestly, because I've never experienced, living with people together and feeling comfortable. Of course, I had friends in Germany who would sometimes come to my flat, but I've often just be like, leave, and only then I can be myself. This was actually a very important lesson that I learned, is that you can be yourself around other people. You don't have to constantly put on an act, because people will kind of like you and accept you the way you are if you give them a chance. So then I started working in the James Hutton Institute in Invergary, and I just really enjoyed it. At the time, I loved biology, I loved what I was doing, had amazing flatmates, great time, everything was going great, until one day I was feeling a little bit ill. From my background now, I get a lot of panic attacks, so feeling a little bit ill is just kind of like, meh. But it got to the point where I couldn't stand up straight, and I was like, okay, something is off. I ended up going to the hospital and getting my appendix taken out, which is a fun thing to do when you're abroad without any family to help you. And at that point, my friend Lotte had already moved to Edinburgh, so poor James had to deal with me not being able to move, to do anything, had to buy my groceries. But I was just basically bedridden for 2 weeks. That is how I ended up on Tinder, because I was like, everyone's working and I can't move, and I can't even watch shows, because if I laugh, my stomach hurts. So I was just like, let's talk to strangers on the internet. And that is how I met Jack. And that's the end. No, obviously not. But I first met Jack quite soon after my surgery, so it was a bit like, I hope you're not expecting anything, because I actually cannot move. But I really liked him and we got along very well, and I was just happy. I loved living in Scotland. I loved being here. I just felt like finally everything made sense. And then obviously my internship ended, and I was meant to go back to Germany, because in Germany, basically, they say you cannot find a job with a bachelor's degree. The bachelor's degree is just leading up to the master's degree. So if I had quit after my bachelor's degree, I wouldn't have found a job at all. But also the master's degree in Scotland was only a year, whereas it's 2 years in Germany. So if I had done a British master's degree and a German bachelor's degree, which is only 3 years, I would have lost a year of education. So it almost felt like I was in this corner where I definitely had to go back to do this German master's degree. But also I had my friends in Scotland, I had my life in Scotland, I had my boyfriend in Scotland, I even had a cat in Scotland, so that was not necessarily the easiest time for me. And it never occurred to me that I could have just stayed. It always felt like there was a way to how things were done and I needed to do them this way, so I did go back to Germany. And that was probably one of the hardest things I've ever done. And I did not have a good time, because I had to spend 1 year of taught classes in Germany, and then I was planning to come back to do the research for my master's project with collaborators of the people I worked with in Dundee. And I really liked the project and I really liked what they were doing. So it was something that I genuinely wanted to do, not just for the sake of coming back to Scotland. And they were based in Glasgow, so even for Jack, he lived in Perth, so he'd have to move. It was like I wanted to come back to Jack and to Scotland, but also it wasn't as easy as just going back to Dundee again. But as you know, I did end up moving back to Scotland eventually. So Jack and I lived apart for an entire year, and it was just kind of like commuting between Scotland and Germany, trying to visit each other as much as possible. So it was a lot of time spent on planes, a lot of traveling, a lot of working really hard, trying to sustain this relationship. It is still what it is, I did it, I've got a master's degree now. But then once the taught part of my master's was finally done, I could finally move back to Scotland. So we looked for a flat in Glasgow, because obviously I was doing this project in Glasgow for my master's thesis, and Jack found himself a job in Glasgow. So we ended up moving in immediately. after having been apart for a year. And at that point we had been together for like 1.5 years. So you may remember from what I said earlier, I had never shared a flat before I moved to Dundee. So I think that experience actually really helped me, because I would have been terrified to move in with a man and give up my personal space, because I've always been very private in a weird way. Like, I mean, obviously I share my entire life on the internet, but I don't like people being in my space. So we moved in together, and Jack brought the cat because his mom got a cat and we fell in love with the cat, and then we decided it's our cat. So that is how we got Tilly. So very soon after moving to Glasgow, I started working at the uni. I did my internship. I really liked the project. I was really feeling it. I loved my supervisor. He was such a lovely guy, such a very relaxed atmosphere. I liked the people I was working with. It was a really, really good time. It just felt like everything was finally coming together. I applied for PhDs because I was like, no, I'm going to be a big researcher and I'm going to do it. And then we moved to the West End and we found this beautiful flat that was like really high, huge ceilings, beautiful floors, everything that I imagined a flat to be, with the beautiful bay windows. And I love the architecture in Scotland, so it was really, really lovely to live there. And it was a 20-minute walk to the uni rather than an hour bus ride, and the neighborhood was very nice and safe. Finally, I felt like things were coming together. And then COVID hit. So obviously I know that most of us probably had quite a difficult time with the lockdowns, because everything's changed so drastically and very suddenly. So the lockdown for me started out with the weird feeling that I was like, okay, are we all actually going to die now? So in that mindset, I got an acceptance for a PhD in Edinburgh. So I was just terrified. I was like, first of all, I can't even get groceries. How am I supposed to move to Edinburgh? But also Jack is a barber, so he's self-employed, but he had only recently become a barber as we had moved to Glasgow, basically. So when we all got furloughed, Jack didn't get any money. So that was a very harsh time for us, because Jack just lost all of his income and was suddenly on benefits rather than making a normal income, because the furlough was calculated on like what you made 2 years prior, but he hadn't been a barber 2 years prior, so he didn't get anything. So it almost felt like living on a PhD salary was just not an option at the time. So I turned down the PhD and I started applying for jobs in Glasgow. I remember very vividly talking to my dad about this, because my dad works for Bayer, or he worked for Bayer at the time, he's retired now. He saw what people with a master's degree in Germany were getting when they started working at Bayer. So he sat me down and he was like, you know, you really have to make up your mind what kind of salary you will settle for. And then he said, you shouldn't settle for anything less than 75,000. Yeah, so salaries in the UK are very, very, very low. Very low. So with a master's degree, I ended up getting paid 22,000 a year, which was a good salary, because many of the jobs I applied for were less than 20,000 a year. So I was already like, yay, I'm making the money. So that was my start into the working life in Scotland. And I feel like even at that point, my family held on to that hope that I would eventually come back to Germany. But then I continued working as a lab technician for 2 years, and then Jack proposed to me in 2020, and then we got married in 2021. We bought a flat in 2021, and we got Archie the same year as well. Obviously, I then also started the PhD in 2022. Yeah, so that's kind of like where I'm at now, doing a PhD. I still have 1.5 years to go to hand in my PhD thesis, and then have to decide what I'll do afterwards. But we've got the flat, the pets, the ring. It's a funny thing, because coming to Scotland, I obviously didn't really expect that I would get married here, but it has always been a dream. So it's almost like, you know, that actually came true. It doesn't necessarily feel like I'm living past me's dream, because I'm still not that happy. So I guess that is a realization I've had to learn the hard way, that even if you move to the perfect country and you live in the perfect neighborhood and you find yourself the perfect husband, mental health comes in cycles. So even though I left Germany behind and I told myself everything will be better when I move to Scotland, it actually isn't. Panic attacks find their way through one way or another. I did not magically cure everything that was wrong with me. I generally feel better. I can leave the house without being terrified, so that is good. So that leads me to the big question. If I was to wake up and suddenly be 22 again, would I all do it again the same way? No. But I would definitely move to Scotland again. I think that was such a big step and it was a dream come true. And I really think it did solve some issues I had, came just from living in Germany. But some things that, again, I will blame Germany for, just my mindset of things have to be done a certain way, led to me then pursuing the master's, working as a lab technician, now doing the PhD. I think I would have done a very different career path if I could go back to being 22 again. I would do the bachelor's again because the bachelor's is what got me here in the first place, but I would not do a master's degree. I would certainly not do a PhD. So I think if I was 22 again in Dundee, I would probably, prior to Brexit, obviously, I would have just stayed and done an apprenticeship. I have so many talents, you know, I do the sewing, drawing, writing, I do all of it. And that is what I really care about, but it never was considered a solid career path in Germany. Maybe the way I was brought up, maybe the way my parents saw it, it just never occurred to me that I could just literally do what I'm good at. So I would not, no way I would go and study biology again. I'm sure you're either here because you have been following me from the start and you're like, okay, what's actually happening now? Or because you were considering moving to Scotland as well. So if you are the latter, here are my thoughts and things I would tell someone who wants to move to Scotland. So there are obviously some pros and cons about the matter, so let's start with the good things. Scottish people are so lovely. So this is definitely one of the main reasons why I stayed here, is just because everyone is so welcoming. And I feel like the best example for this is actually one of the janitors at the uni I was talking to, and he is Glaswegian, and I am obviously not Glaswegian. I talked to him and I said, you know, being German and everything, and he just kind of said, oh no, you're Scottish. And I was like, but my English is very German, you know? And he was like, no, I mean, yeah, you're German, but like if you live in Scotland, you're Scottish. And that is such a mentality here. And that is in a nutshell something that I love so much about Scotland. Because I feel like in Germany, it's very much like, even if you're a third generation from somewhere else, you're Turkish, you're Polish, you're not German. Here people like could not care less that you have an accent, which is so weird, such a weird mentality coming from Germany. Scottish people are so busy hating on the English that they don't have time to hate on any other nationalities. But also in comparison to America, where I was just the German girl, that was all people really cared about, was that I was German. Whereas here, like, often people don't even know where I'm from. I mean, obviously, like I said, they know I'm not Glaswegian, but it just doesn't matter. And then obviously Scotland is beautiful. So every single time Jack wants to go on vacation, I'm just like, but have you seen Glencoe? So there's very little need to go anywhere else if you've just got all this beauty on your doorstep, which is really good for your finances if you don't have to travel the world to get to nice places. But also, as I mentioned, I've got some mental health struggles, you know, autism, panic attacks, general anxiety. It's taken very seriously here, especially at uni. You get a lot of support if you're a student for your mental health issues. So there's a university counseling and there's the disability service. So if you're autistic, you get a lot of kind of like help from the uni because they actually want you to succeed. Because when I started studying in Germany, we were so many students. I think we started with around 500. And they were keen on kicking people out. So the whole point of the German university system is they take on more people than necessary because they want to make it extra hard, so only the very, very best persevere. Whereas in the UK, they do more of a selection up front, but also you pay, so they're kind of like where you're paying for education, so you better actually get it. So they're very keen on trying to get every single student through the degree. So they offer a lot of support, and generally healthcare is for free. So like in Germany, you have to pay for lots of medicine that you get, but here you just get everything for free, which is nice. But let's get to the bad bits about living in Scotland, because not everything can always be as rosy and beautiful as it seems on Instagram, right? So first of all, everything's really expensive. So I know when I talk to my friends in Germany, they're just like, oh, but things got very expensive here as well after COVID. It's like, yeah, but like, trust me when I say things are really expensive in Scotland. Like, I should have known the moment I moved into that flat in Dundee and the heating was on 2 hours a day, because you cannot afford to heat more. It's just everything is so expensive here, which is weird because also we make way less money. So as I said earlier, when I started working as a lab technician with a master's degree at the University of Glasgow, I made 22,000 a year, which was not considered a bad salary. If I was to now finish my PhD and work with my PhD at the uni, I would probably be making between 35 and 40,000 a year. Compared to salaries in Germany, that's not a lot of money, especially when everything else is so much more expensive. It almost feels like in the UK there's this really harsh divide between inherited wealth and normal workers. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the healthcare system is for free, but that also means it is pretty rubbish. So obviously, like, all the nurses and the doctors are not bad doctors. They're all great, but they're just underfunded. It's really hard to ever see anyone. Like, you go to your GP, they have very limited availabilities for things they could do on location. So things like ultrasounds, you have to go to the hospital for, and then you have to kind of like talk to your GP, and they have to assess whether your condition is actually severe enough to justify the hospital staff's time, and then you get on a waiting list, and then you go to the hospital in like 3-4 months time. So in the UK, if you're actually dying, they will take care of you, so don't worry. That is fine. But anything that's kind of like mildly severe but not immediate, that is going to be neglected. So very often you just end up not going to the doctor because where's the point? Another very negative thing is Brexit. Yeah, things were better before Brexit, definitely. I mean, it starts with like having to pay ridiculous import duty on things from Europe. You know, I mean, I talk to many people on Instagram and they say, you came to Scotland, you know, how can I come to Scotland now? There's like weird immigration laws that I am not aware of because I'm pre-settled and soon can change my status to settled status. It just doesn't seem very easy to come here anymore. Before Brexit, you could actually study in Scotland for free as a European student, whereas now you're an international student, so the prices are ridiculously high. I don't even know how much it is, like tens of thousands of pounds on it probably. And something that I didn't consider before moving here, so I will tell you, is you have to be aware there is moisture everywhere. It rains so much in Scotland, which again, I don't actually mind. The ground is very moist and all of the buildings are like 100 to 200 years old. So you will get insane amounts of mold. Things that should probably last you a lifetime will last you 1 or 2 years in Scotland. And I'm talking about shoes, bags, general clothes, everything is moldy. And there's just very little you can do about it. And I've kind of come to terms with it, but it's just also something you think about, you know, when you see all the mold on the walls, and you're just like, am I going to die of this? But it's just everywhere. Unless you move into a very well-built new build, which quite realistically you cannot afford and I cannot afford either. I also don't want to live in a new build, but your Victorian flat will have mold. And your Victorian flat will have huge spiders. So this is something I didn't know, because when I lived in Dundee, I was there from January until August. So coming back to Scotland, I started being here for September, whereas autumn in Scotland is lovely. You are not ready for the size of spiders that live here. And maybe I'm talking to someone here who's from like America, Australia, you know, you've got the wolf spiders in America. That's the kind of spider I'm talking about. But in Germany, we just don't have these kind of spiders. There's almost this unwritten rule in Germany that a spider is either having a thick body or thick legs, but not both. Whereas the common house spider in Scotland has both. They're really big, they're kind of hand-sized, they're fast. They are much quicker than my cat. She cannot catch them. They're everywhere. You get used to them. Now it's a bit different. So after 5 years, you kind of see them and they give you a fright, and then you kill them and you kind of learn to deal with it. But still not my favorite part about it. So like earlier this year, I was just like sitting next to the wall, minding my own business. And I got up and turned around and there was like, quite frankly, massive spider right next to where I sat. I screamed so loud the spider fell off the wall. But then I just got my slipper and went boop, and it was dead, and I was just like having the ick for like the next 3 hours. You get used to it, but no one told me about it, so I'm telling you. And I mean, I've talked about this many times, but the heating habits, it's just something that I had to really get used to. Just the fact that the flats are often colder than the outside. Scottish flats are just freezing, and it's partly because they're Victorian, it's partly because we have a fireplace that's literally connected to like the chimney, and often the windows are terrible quality. So we got new windows last year, so it's gotten a little bit better, but you could just feel like the air constantly moving from the leaks in the window to the fireplace, and you're just like, This is fine. And this is not just this flat, obviously. I've lived in multiple flats. It seems to be common. The flats are just old and they're beautiful and they are well built, but they're just not well maintained. That's the problem. Getting used to the fact that you're constantly cold takes a while. So I feel like nowadays I don't actually mind. What I'm wearing currently, I'm wearing for a video, but my fingers are getting numb. But you get used to it, but it's definitely something you have to consider. If you want to move here, you're going to be cold, and the first like 1 or 2 years are going to be tough, but you're going to get used to it. This was a lot of moving around the flat, a lot of thinking about the past, but it was fun, at least for me. I hope you took something out of it. So to get to my final verdict, was it the right decision to move to Scotland? I would like to think yes, it was the right decision for me and my circumstances. So I think if you're like really, really eager to make a lot of money and to succeed in your career and things like that, maybe Scotland is not the place for you. At least for the university setting that I've been working in, we do work a little bit less than you guys work in Germany. We work 35 hours a week. We also get 30 days of annual leave a year. Maybe that's also part of why we're being paid less. But it is definitely worrying, kind of like the amount of money you're making. Also thinking about retirement and things like this, kind of like, will we actually be able to afford retiring ever? So there are some uncertainties, but I feel like generally speaking, I really like living in Scotland. I love Scottish people. They're all so friendly. I love the architecture. I love the nature here. I like the mindset of people, you know, the whole kind of like, even if you're foreign, you can be part of this community. Everyone here is welcoming. And obviously, you know, I dress a little bit different to most people. There will sometimes be comments, so especially if we get into like a bit rougher areas, that's when you start kind of like attracting some attention. But I can just walk through Glasgow city centre in my Edwardian attire. And like sometimes people will be like, oh, I love your dress, but most of the time people will just kind of be like, yeah, you're dressed, whatever. But even that all being said, I know it is not that easy to move to Scotland for anyone who is not pre-settled or settled or has British nationality. I unfortunately cannot give any advice on what the best way is to do that, unless you're really, really rich and you can just afford to be an international student. So I will not be able to tell you how to move to Scotland, but rather, you know, if you were moving to Scotland, this is how I feel about it. But I guess that is where life has gotten me. Living in a little countryside village in the suburbs of Glasgow with my British husband and my Romanian rescue dog, my very British cat. So I guess in this case, emigration actually worked out for some reason. Lucky me, I guess. I still have goals, you know, our flat is only 55 square meters, so it is very small, and with 2 people, we just constantly get in each other's way. So we would like to buy a bigger flat one day. But again, you have now taken from my rambling that we are not rich. So just being able to afford stuff like that. Maybe if I actually finish my PhD and maybe actually work in science for a little bit, we can maybe afford a bigger flat. Maybe a second dog. But yeah, I hope you took something from this video. So let me know in the comments, you know, how do you feel about Scotland? Would you move here? Is this something you're dreaming of? I definitely have my fingers crossed for you. I'll be back to my normal sewing, creating routine soon. So if you like listening to me with my German accent, come and join the club and subscribe and like and comment and support me. And I love you all, and bye-bye.